In one of the remote corners of Europe, among dense forests, abandoned villages, and lonely roads, there exists a legend about a mysterious entity known as SCP-4975. This entity is shrouded in mystery and fear, and merely mentioning it makes the locals shrink in terror. They whisper about strange disappearances and unexplained phenomena associated with SCP-4975. On one gray and cold day, when the sky was covered with heavy clouds, a group of researchers from the SCP Foundation set off to these regions to unravel the mystery and find out what was hidden in this dark corner of the world. Their mission was simple: gather as much information as possible about SCP-4975, and if possible, capture it for further study. The journey began in a small town located on the edge of the forest. The residents of this town were visibly anxious and avoided talking about SCP-4975. However, one old man, sitting on a bench near his dilapidated hut, agreed to share the story he knew from his ancestors. "This forest has always been cursed," he began, staring into the void. "They say an ancient evil dwells here, awakening every 100 years. People disappear, and no one ever sees them again. Those who return go mad and cannot tell what happened to them." The researchers listened to the old man, trying not to miss a single detail. He spoke of strange sounds that could be heard at night, rustles and quiet whispers coming from the depths of the forest, of mysterious figures flickering among the trees, and of terrifying screams that made one's blood run cold. Despite all the warnings, the group of researchers decided to continue their journey. They entered the forest, feeling the heavy gaze of an invisible entity upon them. With each step, their surroundings grew more sinister. The trees seemed alive, their branches reaching out to the researchers like hands trying to grab them. The wind carried strange smells, reminiscent of a mixture of decay and rot. Suddenly they heard a quiet but distinct sound, a rustle that seemed artificial, as if someone was deliberately trying to attract their attention. The group stopped, listening intently, and then, from behind the trees, a silhouette appeared. It moved slowly and unnaturally, like a puppet on strings. It was a person, but his movements were distorted, and his face devoid of emotion. The eyes were empty, lifeless. As the entity approached, it became clear that this was one of those who had once disappeared in this forest. His body was mutilated, and strange symbols were visible on his skin. He was mumbling something to himself, but the words were incomprehensible. The researchers tried to talk to him, but he did not respond. Suddenly, the man turned sharply and began to run. The group followed him, hoping he would lead them to the mystery of SCP-4975. However, the further they went, the more they felt trapped. Forest grew denser, and there was no way back. Soon, they found themselves in a clearing surrounded by ancient ruins. In the center stood an altar scattered with bones and ancient artifacts. Here, they felt the presence of something ancient and powerful. One of the researchers, examining the altar, found an old diary that apparently belonged to one of the local residents who had disappeared many years ago. The diary revealed that SCP-4975 was an entity that awakened every century to feed on the souls of people. It dwelled in the shadows, feeding on the fear and despair of its victims. Its silhouette was impossible to discern clearly, but those who had seen it described it as a shadow with terrifying eyes, glowing in the dark. The researchers realized they were close to solving the mystery, but with this came the realization of the danger they had gotten themselves into. They decided to leave, but as soon as they took a step back, the darkness thickened around them. The sounds grew louder, and soon they realized they were being watched. The entity began to play, enjoying their fear. The researchers began to lose contact with each other. One by one, they disappeared into the darkness, their screams tearing through the night. The last one standing realized the entity fed not only on their fear, but also on their minds. Each one who disappeared became part of this forest, losing their human essence. At the last moment, when the researcher was on the verge of madness, he remembered the old man's words that the only way to avoid this fate was not to show fear. Summoning all his willpower, he closed his eyes and tried to focus on positive thoughts. Silence enveloped him, and when he opened his eyes, the darkness dissipated. He found himself on the edge of the forest, alive but with deep scars on his soul. The story of SCP-4975 spread among the locals, attracting the attention of not only the Foundation, but also various paranormal investigators and thrill-seekers. Tales of the sinister entity dwelling in the dark forests became the subject of discussions on forums and social media. One such group of investigators, calling themselves ghost hunters, decided to venture into that very forest to find evidence of SCP-4975. Their goal was not only to explore the forest, but also to record their adventures on video for their YouTube channel. They were sure their viewers would appreciate the gripping footage and eerie tales of the mystical entity. The group consisted of 4 people: the team leader, his assistant, the cameraman, and the sound specialist. They meticulously prepared for the expedition, taking with them all the necessary equipment: cameras, microphones, flashlights, as well as provisions and medical supplies. Before departure, they contacted the Foundation to get permission for the investigation and access to the archives. The Foundation agreed to provide information, but warned the ghost hunters about the high risk and danger associated with SCP-4975. Receiving the necessary documents, the group set off on their journey, full of enthusiasm and determination. The first few days passed relatively quietly. They set up camp on the edge of the forest and began their investigation. At first, the forest seemed no different from other forests they had explored before. However, they soon noticed strange phenomena. The trees seemed to move, the rustles grew louder, and sometimes it seemed as though someone was watching them. One night, while they were sitting by the campfire, strange things began to happen. Their equipment started malfunctioning, the flashlights flickered, and the cameras recorded strange interference. Soon they heard whispers coming from the depths of the forest. They were barely discernible but sounded familiar and simultaneously frightening. The team leader decided to check what was happening and took one of the participants with him. The others stayed by the fire, trying to fix the equipment and figure out the recordings. They walked slowly, cautiously moving deeper into the forest. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, and there was a dead silence. They paused, listening, but heard nothing. Returning to the camp, they found that the remaining participants had disappeared. The fire was still smoldering, and the equipment was scattered around. The team leader began to panic, but soon noticed tracks leading deeper into the forest. They followed them, hoping to find their friends. The tracks led them to an old cabin that looked very old and abandoned. Inside, they found their friends sitting on the floor, staring into space. Their eyes were empty, their faces expressionless. They said nothing and did not react to their surroundings. The team leader tried to bring them back to consciousness, but to no avail. He realized they had fallen victim to SCP-4975. Suddenly, the cabin door slammed shut, and the room plunged into darkness. He heard a quiet laugh coming from the corners of the room. Fear gripped him, and he realized the entity was playing with them. Seconds felt like eternity, and at that moment, he remembered the old man's words that the entity fed on fear. He gathered all his strength and decided not to give in to panic. Gradually, the laugh began to fade, and the light in the room returned. His friends started coming to their senses, though they looked very frightened and exhausted. They escaped the cabin and returned to the camp. The group decided to halt the expedition and leave the forest. Returning home, they published their recordings and recounted what had happened. Their video went viral, garnering millions of views and numerous comments. A few months after the incident with the ghost hunters, the SCP Foundation received another request to investigate SCP-4975. This time it was a group of 3 scientists specializing in the study of anomalous phenomena and the psychology of fear. They were determined and ready for any difficulties that might come their way. The scientists began their research by analyzing the records and reports of previous groups that had ventured into the forest. They noticed that all cases were linked to specific time intervals and weather conditions. The forest seemed particularly active at night, during a certain phase of the moon, and specific weather. They developed a research plan considering all these factors and set off to the forest. They had the latest equipment for capturing anomalous phenomena, as well as devices for monitoring the participants' condition. The scientists understood that SCP-4975 fed on fear, and therefore took measures to minimize emotional impact. The first night of their investigation passed without incident. They set up camp and began collecting data. The equipment recorded the usual sounds of the forest, and everything seemed normal. However, on the second night, the situation began to change. They started noticing strange shadows and hearing rustles coming from the depths of the forest. The scientists decided to scout ahead and set up additional cameras in various parts of the forest. They split into two groups to cover a larger area. Soon, one of the groups stumbled upon the old cabin mentioned by previous investigators. They entered and found strange symbols carved into the walls and floor. At this moment, the other group began experiencing problems with their equipment. The cameras recorded strange interference, and the flashlights flickered. The scientists started feeling a sense of anxiety and panic, and at that moment, they heard the whisper described by the ghost hunters. One of the group members, a psychology specialist, tried to stay calm and focus on her breathing. She realized that the whisper was affecting their consciousness and causing fear. She decided to try a visualization method to reduce fear and regain control of the situation. Gradually, the whisper began to fade, and the equipment started working normally. The scientists realized their assumptions were correct. SCP-4975 fed on fear and negative emotions. They decided to combine efforts and return to the cabin to continue their investigation. When they returned, the group remaining in the cabin discovered another diary belonging to one of the disappeared residents. It described rituals and ceremonies conducted in this forest to appease SCP-4975. These ceremonies included sacrifices and spells intended to protect the residents from the entity. The scientists decided to attempt one of the rituals to test its effectiveness. They followed the instructions from the diary and set up an altar in the center of the cabin. The rituals involved using ancient artifacts and reciting spells in an ancient language. As they performed the ritual, the forest around them came alive. The trees seemed to move, and the rustles grew louder. Suddenly, they heard a loud screech that made them freeze in terror. The entity began manifesting itself, and darkness thickened around. One of the scientists, a specialist in paranormal phenomena, decided to use his special equipment to capture the anomalous activity. He set up devices around the cabin and began recording everything happening. Suddenly, they saw a shadow slowly approaching them. The entity was invisible, but its presence was felt throughout their bodies. The scientists continued reciting the spells, and at some point, the entity stopped. The shadow disappeared, and the forest fell silent again. They realized the ritual had worked, and the entity had retreated. Returning to the Foundation, the scientists presented their data and evidence of SCP-4975's existence. Their research confirmed the theory that the entity fed on fear and could be neutralized using certain rituals and spells. The story of SCP-4975 became one of the most discussed topics in scientific circles and among paranormal enthusiasts. The scientists' videos and recordings generated enormous interest, and many people wanted to venture into that forest to experience it for themselves. However, the Foundation warned that the forest remained dangerous, and no one could guarantee the safety of those who ventured on this journey. SCP-4975 continued to remain a mystery, and every new researcher risked becoming a victim of the silent horror lurking in the shadows.